So I watched the conference that was in the beginning of your documentary with Jack Ma and Elon Musk. And at the time when they were talking about the predicted, like the biggest global crisis in 20 years is going to be population collapse. And I watched that at the time and I was like, what are they talking about? This goes counter to everything that we've been told, or at least my generation's been told. Why? And then in the documentary, it kinda, like, goes it's backdated to these, like, really old interviews of news anchors also saying it, and it somehow went under the radar. So do you know, I guess, like, where did this idea of a population bomb become so popularized, and somehow what seems to be the indisputable truth that it's actually the opposite was under the radar for so long?
Yeah, and, as I think you know, I came into this as a demographer in 2016. Shocked to see falling birth rates in almost every country in Europe. We all think about Japan, where I now happen to live and where I am tonight. But when I saw this is a global trend that started in the 70s and hasn't relented at all, it's just spread and spread and spread. It was shocking to me. So you're right. Like, how do we have this idea that the world's population is growing on forever? That's the image, this impression I had.
Mhm.
And you start to see when you're looking at data is objective, that the people who have controlled the narrative, and I think it's a variety of reasons. Maybe some people think they're doing good by controlling the narrative. Maybe they think it's good to make us all believe that the world's going to, explode in a bomb of population. There has been growth, but just to explain, when you see that narrative has not changed since the 70s, it's not objective. It's a form of ideology. And it's
Mhm.
really easy to spot because when you take someone who, let's say, works for a so called population organization, every time they draw a chart of population, it usually starts in 1800, and then they do this line like this, and then they stop. That's all they do for effect. And when you look at the actual data, yes, sure, that's right. But then we know it's going to do this, and this is going to be mainly older people, and then it's going to go down. And you realize they're only telling half of the story, the historical part of the story, and they're not updating their narrative. And as a data scientist, that's rather annoying because I want to debate with objective people. But what I've seen during the documentary and after making it is there's a lot of people out there clearly with their own agendas, whatever those are. And just on your point about people saying, we hear it all the time, there's too many people on the planet. That's intended to be a conversation closer. When people say that, or when people are taught to think that way, we're supposed to not think anymore about the implications of population decline for countries like Japan and Europe, and US is on the same path. In reality, come on, let's be serious. There's a change about to happen. It's already well underway in many countries, and we need to be talking about this if nothing else. So for me, it's really calling out those people who have agendas. And what frankly pleases me is they seem to be rather upset that my documentaries come out just explaining the reality and the facts. So I hope that people start to realize the reality is that population is slowing, and we're about to enter a very new world.
So, as you mentioned, you have been living in Japan, and that's where you currently are. Why do they seem to be so far ahead of everyone else? Because I recently had this man Sho Niyamoto on, and he's kind of like this spiritual influencer, and he's based in Japan as well. And we were discussing how like the average age of a virgin male in Japan is 30 now. Like that is unprecedented. People aren't getting married, people aren't having children, and there's I don't know, it's weird because you have this culture that for so long seemed to be more advanced as far as like spirituality and connection and family and like ikigai, purpose, and for some reason it seems like they kind of got flipped on their head.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I think there's a lot written about the surface of this, meaning the top level facts like the average age of a virgin in Japan. But you really got to go so much deeper than that. I want to qualify one thing first, though. We all think, certainly I did, that Japan is the outlier or that Japan started first. That's
Yeah.
not true at all. It actually started in Germany several years before Japan in the late 60s. And then Italy, Spain, many countries in Europe caught up at the same time of Japan, same time as Japan in 1974. I don't know why we've come to think of Japan only. Maybe it just fits a narrative that Japan's different, or that perhaps Europe has focused on some immigration to kind of offset this a little bit, which has not been very effective. The point is, this is cross culture. This is not about Japanese culture or not Korean culture or Italian or German culture. This is a global phenomenon. But to come to your specific point about sexlessness, yes, it's certainly a thing here. I've met people, I've talked to people that are in that position, which I find quite incredible. But I think the same effect now has hit the US. I'm reading a lot about young people who are voluntarily or otherwise, checking out of the dating market, or just have given up on that. So it comes down to me to a case of, well, what's cause and what's effect?
Mhm.
I think certainly what I see here is a situation where younger men in particular are being, yeah, and some to some extent pushed out of the dating market. Women's education's higher here, which is great. Education careers are equal right now, and I see absolutely women here going for more educated men and more educated, career successful people here. And I think this part of society just doesn't get a chance quite so much. I think men oftentimes are giving up on life, giving up in society, and giving up on dating. Now that's a huge topic in its own right, and I don't claim to be a complete expert on it, but I don't I don't believe for a second that any country's birth rate is falling because of sexlessness. I think it's the other way around. I think, and it's clear, this started in the early 70s here, and then we have these interesting, different, perhaps bizarre phenomenons coming after that.
So did you find a commonality that happened within, like, that time period of the 1970s? Because that was a really interesting part of the first part of the documentary, is that it does seem to transcend culture and religion and country. Like, there's not a lot of people might blame something like dating apps or social media or pornography or whatever, like, right, we want to find like a silver bullet to this. And when you see it, it started before a lot of these things, if it was in the 70s, so this is pre-internet. And then if you have something that seems to be taking place in some place like Japan and the Middle East and also in America, like, there's vast difference in the way that we approach life and culture and our belief systems. So it's like, what happened in the 70s that seemed to permeate through all of these things?
And that's really where the documentary starts. As you mentioned, I came here to research this. I didn't know, but no researcher had found a connection before. They'd found potential reasons within Japan. It was blamed on work-life balance in Japan. They do
Mhm.
work incredibly hard here, even today. In Italy and Spain, it was blamed on youth unemployment. So each country had its own potential causes. But for me, this happened at the same moment in time and has spread relentlessly. And what I mean by that, it's not like it was a wave that came into parts of Japan and then faded back and then kind of took off again. This hit Japan, rural and urban areas. Well, I'll tell you, in the same month, this was July 74. And you can see every single prefecture in Japan, I think it's 46 at that time, 46 prefectures, all had a sudden decline in fertility rates, and they declined from there. So it was a momentary thing, and that's wonderful, as a data scientist, because you can look at that, and you can quantify that, and the probability of that happening natural is just astronomical. It's like tossing a coin 46 times and having heads turn up every single time. We see the same thing in Italy. We see the same thing anywhere we've got data. The same trends show up. So to answer your question, the oil shock happened in October 73. There was a huge crisis of escalating oil prices. I vaguely remember that as a small child, but I never came here thinking that would be connected. But what happened was Japan, as the world's biggest oil importer at that time, went into a form of social panic. It's all over the historical media. You can see empty shelves, rising prices. And from that moment, there was a fall in birth rate. So that's interesting. So, why was that? I really don't like talking about the average woman or the average birth rate because it really masks so many things. I think, that's been one of the reasons we haven't really understood this trend, because we tend to look at total fertility rate. No, we need to go deeper. And when you do that, you find that in that moment of time, so 9 months after the oil shock, birth rates go down. But who is it that has experienced these lower fertility? People with one child already actually accelerated having the second child for a year or two. I think that was people thinking this might get bad economically, that we should have the second child we always wanted quite quickly. So that's interesting. Those with two, three, four plus all continued having the exact same number of children as they would have had anyway. Statistically, there was no change. The big change is that childlessness went from around 4% in Japan in 73. Within 3 years, it was up to 22%, and then it went up to 30%. I mean, this is an unprecedented demographic change of a mass number of young people deciding to defer parenthood. So instead of having a child at age 26, 27, very quickly that was pushed into late 20s and early 30s. And guess what happens at that? When you defer childbearing, not everybody who wants to have a child ends up having one.
Mhm.
And why? Fertility is a factor, but actually the biggest reason is not being in a relationship at the right time with the right person, or going through a divorce or a breakup. So we find that around 1/3 of Japanese society, starting then, when delayed parenthood became a thing, up to today, are childless, and 80% or perhaps more of those is what I call unplanned childlessness. People planning to have a child in their 30s, and then something goes wrong. It's a series of factors, and people get more tired in their 30s. They have breakups. Finding a partner that matches is harder. That's Japan, which we I know a lot about because I got so much data. But you see the exact same trend in Europe at the same moment in time. So this is deferred parenthood through economic vulnerability.